Should I sit close then, because I don't feel like I'm likely to say that? Would you like me to sit between you and the mic? Okay, is over here somewhere?
And I haven't seen the, I've seen the yeah, we did. No. Oh, really? Oh, that's bad.
Okay. Okay, good. Yeah.
We're not really showing that.
I know. I'm going to go to full screen mode and see what happens.
Let me distribute the solutions.
That's not good.
No, the voice. What happened? Why is this really so?
Everybody already.
What? I mean.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Now there's no fighting. There's no. Like, now it's good. It's what meaningless was so
Hi, we're about to start.
So if you would like to sit down, this is the Mtgvenue working group, and this is Melinda Shore, I'm Jonas Soininen, and we would like to start, so you need to sit down or at least be quiet. You can choose to do both as well.
Sure. Okay. So as usual, the note about what's a contribution and how that your behavior here applies. The agenda for today, we're going to start. The first thing we're going to do is ask for a Jabber scribe and a note taker. Thank you very much. Which
Jabber.
Jabber, do we have somebody to take minutes?
No, I don't think he.
No, you're not volunteering, huh?
No, he's escaping.
Okay. We'd be grateful if.
Oh.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Okay, so I guess the other thing is that for the Jabber scribe, is there anybody on the in the Jabber room who is not in this room? They should make themselves known to the Jabber scribe. Okay, so welcome. This is our first ever meeting. We are chartered to produce basically two documents at this point. They are a document describing the process by which venue location decisions are made, and the other is a policy that's going to be applied through that process. So right now we've got a call for adoption out on the process document, which is Fred Baker's document, That call for adoption closes on Friday. We will be issuing a call for adoption on the policy document, probably after the next revision. This is the document that Suresh has contributed. Unfortunately, it doesn't have meeting venue in the string meeting venue in the title, in the name, so it's not showing up on the working group page, but it is the one under discussion, and it is draft Krishnan IETF meeting policy. Okay, so basically we're going to talk about those two documents. There have been a couple of other drafts that were written. Andrew Sullivan and Alyssa Cooper have contributed a document on sort of how to make decisions about venues given conflicting priorities. The other is a draft on metrics for participation as a way of guiding some of these decisions. That's from Nalini. So any additions, changes, deletions? If not, we can go to Fred.
So I'm breaking an IETF tradition here. I'm operating without slides. We went through the process. I'm sorry, what? I don't know.
Yes.
In any event, so we went through the process document in some detail at IETF 95, and there have been some more comments on the meeting venue mailer. The only one, going through comment by comment, the only one that struck me as substantive that I really needed to go address in text was from Alyssa Cooper. I asked her to suggest text. I got some of that over the weekend, so I've got some homework to do there. My objective today is to solicit any other comments that are there. Ideally, I would like to close this draft out. Now, we're going to have some discussion with Andrew and Alyssa later, and they, I think, would like to have their draft folded into the process document. And if that's what the working group wants, fine, that's what we'll do. You need to tell me that.
Right, we'll be discussing that when they.
Right,
yeah.
right, but that's Andrew and Alyssa. So what I'm dealing with right now is the process document as it stands. Do people have further issues that they would like to see addressed?
One thing that came up when we were talking was that is this question of whether or not the problem of moving meetings is discussed or should be discussed, because it's not in the documents right now.
The problem of moving a meeting?
Right.
Ray, do you want to comment on that? No, we don't have anything in the document about moving meetings.
Yeah, so if I can explain, so Ray, just as you're getting up to the going to the microphone, the kind of like example came out if we would have a meeting in a place where for some reason, for health and safety reasons or for political situation or for other reasons, we couldn't go anymore, and we would have picked the meeting venue, would have introduced that we have a meeting, and it might be even a short notice. That should we need a process for doing that, and what kind of criteria that process should have? And that was a question that we had in our minds.
Okay.
Should that be kind of covered in the draft?
So we actually looked at that in some detail with Buenos Aires. There's this virus down there that seemed a little bit of a problem. And we asked the question very seriously, should we move the meeting to one of a number of places? And Ray ran around and did some research. And what we found in that case was that the actual incidence of the virus was about the same at the other, was it 2 different locations that we were looking for or looking at. And the meeting committee kind of didn't see the point of moving it. But we asked the question of should we? So Ray, let me defer to you on this one.
Sure. Ray Pelletier, IAD. So let's talk about Buenos Aires in particular.
Could you put your face in the mic a little closer
Sure.
together?
So the Zika virus was an issue, but it could be obviously something else that would come up in that circumstance. As we saw that the possibility, not necessarily the probability of the meeting having to either be canceled or moved, we set about the business of identifying locations in which we could get availability, and with hotel chains with which we had experience, such that we could affect a contract in a very quick fashion. And in fact, we had done that. We identified. We actually looked at probably about a dozen different places, and finally settled on Quebec as being the backup location, and having the terms and conditions of the contract worked out but not executed in case we had to. So imagine though, as we get closer to the meeting, there's a pivot point at which you could possibly do that. There's equipment being shipped. There are, sponsors that have made plans. Everyone has done their airlines and hotel reservations, but there's a pivot point, whether it's 45 days out, 30 days out, there's a number at which you have to make that decision. Inside that point, the meeting is either canceled or goes virtual. And so that's the other possibility. And at the same time that we were doing this, looking at a backup location, I was talking to Mtgvenue about, can we go virtual? And I think, conditions are getting to be such that at some point in time, we may wind up doing that as a real possibility, rather than cancel the meeting entirely, going virtual on the meeting. So having it as part of the conditions, I can tell you we're doing it. And in fact, what we're doing now, I don't know if Laura's here, but what we're doing now is, as we begin the year, we are looking for backup locations in front of every meeting, because we don't know what's going to happen. Nice, look at what's happening around the world, right? So we're looking at backup locations even now for other venues that are coming up. I don't know if that helped you.
Yeah, I think we understand that you are capable of doing that, but the question is more that should some of that be documented in the draft? Of course not, kind of like, I don't think it has to be a decision tree or something like that. That's not what I'm envisioning, but basically having something there that you come to this point, you have selected the meeting venue, everything is fine, and something happens. Should there be a process? And that is something you don't have to answer now, but the question is basically, should there be a process that we have documented that what happens in those kind of situations, and which maybe the policy document should say when to trigger that process.
So you might want to think then about the variables, and that is, as I just told you about the dates in front of the meeting by which we make the pivot decisions, right? What do you think the community might expect a decision to be made? Is it 45 days out, 60 days out? After a certain point in time, it's not reasonable to pivot the community to go from Buenos Aires to Quebec. And so maybe some consideration about that. So where those decision points are made. And of course, it could be the day before the meeting. There's an earthquake or something else happens that the meeting has to be canceled to go virtual, for example.
Right, so documenting some of those and maybe some of the dates, at least on the kind of like high level.
Okay, so I can go offline with Ray and with Laura and sort out such a process. And what I would kind of want to see in the policy document then is, what are the variables?
Yeah.
You're not channeling anybody other than myself. When Ray said that the meeting can go virtual, is there actually a plan for that? Because we have the physical meeting with remote participants. I don't think we really have a set plan for holding a totally virtual meeting, and we couldn't come up with such a plan within a day or a week unless we have it in advance.
To my knowledge, there isn't such a plan at this time, but we could put our heads together and come up with one.
Yeah, just providing personal opinion on the question of the specifying the process. When something surprising happens, I think the draft should say something about that, but it should be relatively high level. We really don't, in my opinion, want to discuss the detailed dates and such. It's too dependent on the situation. But basically, we do have already this process that if something happens, we will reevaluate and see what we can do. And on the question of this large-scale virtual meeting, it's been a topic of IST suggestion. We're setting up a design team to figure out if we could do that, and, for various reasons, not such as for emergency. But that's a topic outside this working group.
If we were going to seriously address tomorrow, let's start a virtual meeting worldwide, I'd really want to prototype that in some way. And I think a way to do that, we have experimented with large-scale interim meetings and kind of a bust, but I could imagine having a large-scale virtual interim meeting and just see what happens.
I mean, all of those are concerns that that particular team is looking at. So today we don't have an answer. We could not do it if we had to cancel now and do something tomorrow. But hopefully in the future we'll have some more answers, including testing some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Alyssa Cooper, I have a different topic, so are we ready to move on?
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So there are a couple of items from our exchange on the list that don't actually have text or an obvious resolution yet. So I know you said that, Fred, that you kind of don't want to talk about them, or you think they're accounted for, but I was wondering if we should touch on a couple of those while we have the meeting today, or if you don't want to talk about those at all.
Well, you want to suggest one?
Sure. So one is this, the notion of what is the point of this draft?
I'm
So,
sorry, she coughed.
it's okay. So one question is sort of about what is the point of this draft? And one thing that has come up is, and I don't even remember exactly which of the suggestions it was, but I made some suggestion and you said that, well, people always complain about that. And it was probably the one roof, right? People always complain about that, so that's why it's in there. And I had kind of been thinking that one nice thing about writing an RFC is that it sort of overcomes the tyranny of complaints after every meeting cycle, because it then, you can always refer back to, that's great that you're complaining right now. We have a policy that we decided by rough consensus in the IETF that says the opposite of that. So, too bad, or if you want to change it, here's the process to change it. So I'm just hoping that as people think through the list of the criteria, that we can be open to the potential that when we actually do a call for consensus on this draft, that consensus might be very different from the complaints that are heard perennially, because lots of people don't care to engage in non-complaint on a regular basis, if you see what I mean. So I think it's important to keep that in mind about this, that even tenants that people feel are very strongly about because there's been so many complaints aren't necessarily what should be reflected in this draft, because it might be the case that we could achieve rough consensus around something else if lots more people started providing their opinion other than the people who complain.
Okay.
Okay, I'm channeling John Clenson to comment. So if I remember, we actually did move at least one meeting, although not at the last minute. That's the Asia Pacific to Vancouver switch, and this discussion should remember that. And the second comment is, unless doing a meeting entirely remotely is not considered a viable option, Fred's comment that I interpret as, we could think about that if we need to, is not adequate. Not only does the community need to have plans for that as a contingency, but a document like this needs to discuss the conditions and/or mechanisms for making the determination that it is necessary.
Yeah, I think that what Fred actually said, and Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, you said that you were actually going to look at text that you could add to the document that should talk about these kind of things. So I'm not sure John's second comment was really on point here.
Yeah, what I said was that I go talk with Ray and Laura and see what we could come up
Yeah.
with.
Yeah, Ray Pelletier. With regard to the first point, we've never pivoted a meeting from a location with which we've had a contract in Asia, for example, to Vancouver. We may have found, and I think in the early years of implementing the 111, in 13-14, we may have found that the prices were too high and things were unavailable, and we wound up going to Vancouver. And it could have been anywhere, but we went to Vancouver. Vancouver is not in Asia. We recognize that. Don't get on us again about that. It's over. But it's usually readily available and pretty good price points. So we haven't done that. What we have done is we moved the Atlanta meeting to 2012 to accommodate the fact that we could get into Beijing in 2010 or some dates. I forget what the dates are now. We moved that meeting because we could, under the contract, move it within a certain time period. So we just put it off so that we could get into Asia. So we actually made an effort to get into Asia, but that's the only time we've kind of made a change in the dates contracts.
So the one case that I can think of where we literally didn't go to a venue and went to a different venue was in August 1990. Microsoft was going to host a meeting, and for whatever reason it fell through. That didn't happen. So we went for the first time outside the United States. We went 80 miles north. Dave.
Dave Crocker. So as the sequence, I think, has just said, during the course of relatively normal planning, there has been some experience with making changes to different venues that has been handled, and some have been a little more awkward, some have been less wonderful venues, but basically that's a process that has been exercised a number of times over the years, and generally the staff know how to do that. The thing that came up that strikes me as really interesting and really difficult, and probably not possible, but at least worth exploring, is the one of the really sudden last minute change. The example Ray gave was an earthquake. There's many other possibilities. The sense of a completely virtual meeting that I've had with what the available tools are is that we're not there yet. On the other hand, if we really don't have a choice, it's amazing what we can get done.
Mm-hmm.
And the catch is, for something at the scale of a full IETF meeting, that won't get done unless we plan for it. And the other lesson of emergency procedures is they don't work unless they get used. And so developing the procedure and just waiting to use it doesn't work for normal emergency procedures. And for something like this, which we already know will be at the ragged edge of what's possible and possibly beyond that ragged edge, it's worth thinking about putting a serious and substantial effort into planning for that contingency and, in fact, testing it.
Hence my comment about prototyping it. Nalini.
Nalini Elkins. You know, this really sounds like business continuity and disaster recovery planning that most businesses do. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other comments on the draft? Okay, thanks.
No, wait a minute, there is one
okay.
last comment.
Sorry, Tobias Gonum, I was too slow. So you're right, this is business continuity. I think the thing which is valuable for us is to understand the time points that would be good for the community as a whole, at which points we need to trigger certain steps. Because we can come up with stuff, but the time points is something that the community should tell us, or we can learn from the community what time points are good for you. Like, is 1 day notice time good, or is 60 days good? I think that is some feedback that is really valuable for us if we can find it. And of course, the rest is homework. Yeah.
In that context. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Nalini Elkins again. Well, you know, I mean, by its very nature, disaster recovery is in a disaster. I mean, like my customers, you know, I mean, there was I think Hurricane Sandy in the United States. The next day, or in an hour, they had to switch from one data center to the other. I mean, that's what happens. You know, even I, as a small company, I mean, I have to provide my business continuity plans for what I have to do. I don't think it's unreasonable. I mean, as Ray said, it's unfortunate that we live in a world where not only natural disasters, but some unnatural disasters can occur. It doesn't seem unreasonable to have a backup plan. And I think this whole thing, I think the meeting venue, the decision thing, I think that's a very important thing. I think, you know, frankly, that's why we got into this whole thing to start with, is it wasn't clear like what the priorities, you know, were, and there was some conflict. But this is a slightly different thing. I think if you can, I mean, if you can think of it that way, it's like there's planned unfortunateness that can happen, and when one plans to not have horrible things happen. I mean, I don't know how, if I'm not saying this right, but you know what I mean? It's like you plan, it's like insurance. You get fire insurance because you could have a fire.
Mary Barnes. So I thought this document was great. I think it was a great idea to kind of distill things up to a higher level. I just had one comment on the accessibility point, because it seemed to focus on just physical disabilities, if you will. And I don't know if that was intentional. Because, for example, the American Disability Act, as well as physical, okay. I like to look at people when I talk.
I can't hear you.
So the American Disability Act covers the accessibility, which I think is the most familiar thing to most people, but it also covers invisible disabilities. So, and things that kind of fit into that category are celiac disease. And the expectation is that any company that has more than 50 employees, if they, for example, if they provide food to employees, they actually must also accommodate people with the dietary restrictions. And so I'm just wondering if you guys intentionally left it at just the physical disabilities, or, right, or whether you considered that factor.
Which draft are you talking about?
No, we are not,
No, we're not
actually,
here
sorry.
yet, sorry.
Yeah,
We're still on, we'll come back to you.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry to confuse people. It was just, Fred, this happens when you don't have slides. People get confused.
We'll have to bring a blank slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, okay. So, I mean, the comments that are in the process document about disabilities, basically, I'm not convinced that worldwide there is the same standard regarding disabilities. And it's very difficult for us to say everybody in the world will adhere to US law, or will, you know, do something that's very specific. What we can say, and most places have some kind of statement about disability in building codes and that kind of thing, and say that, number one, we will prefer, if we have a choice of facilities, we'll prefer one that meets US standards. But in any event, we require that they meet their local standards. And that's what the statement is that's in there. If somebody has a problem with that statement, then I guess I need to change that, but I need that guidance.
Okay, nothing else?
Okay.
Okay, so I saw Suresh come in.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay, thanks. Hi, my name is Suresh. So I wrote this draft to talk about the meeting policy of the IETF. That's like a high-level guidance, not really the details that Fred is talking about and Andrew and Alice have written about, but like really high-level policy. So
This is,
It seems that the format is somehow not the best possible for this screen.
Okay, perfect, thanks.
If you would have sent it out earlier, we might have caught it.
Thank you.
but-
Mea culpa, yeah. Thank you. So, currently the IETF has something called a 1-1-star meeting policy. And this was adopted like in a IAOC meeting some time ago. And we presented it at the plenary, but it's like never been put in a community consensus document before. And we've been following this over the past 6 years, right? So, yeah. So about 6 years. And the idea is of this draft is to document it somewhere so we can get community consensus behind this and try to define what the regions mean and what the rotation means and what the wildcard meetings mean pretty much, okay? So if you talk about the goals of the meeting policy, what we're trying to do is like distribute the travel pain between the participants who actually participate physically. So if you have participants from 3 continents, and if you rotate between the 3 continents, like the travel pain kind of gets distributed evenly between the participants. And with also remote participants, we want to distribute the time zone pain, right? So if you're like in North America, participating remotely in Asia is going to be very difficult, even if you don't manage to make it and you sit down. I have like colleagues of mine who are participating from Canada right now who are having a hard time getting up at like 2 a.m., right, to do these things. So the idea is to rotate it so at least 1 meeting a year, people either have easy flight, easy train ride, or like an easy remote participation experience. And also one potential goal that people have talked about, but it's not, I haven't seen any indication that there's like an official policy for this, is to attract new participants. So Yari sent out a note to the list that is not something that we officially do, but since it's come up many times, it's something that's up for discussion. Okay.
Well, I think, at least we can have that discussion.
Right. Yeah, thanks.
So,
So to define the 1-1-star meeting policy, so let's try to write down what the 1-on-1 policy is. So it's all in the draft. So I'm just trying to summarize the draft. So please read the draft if you haven't. So the 1-on-1 policy is like we rotate between 3 regions, and right now they're defined as North America, Europe, and Asia. And the reason for this characterization is we look at people who've written drafts pretty much over the past X years, and the highest distributions come from these areas. Okay, so this is nothing that's like random, right? Like the idea is, so if you look at like Yari, like he maintains like a set of statistics for draft authors in the IETF, and so that's something that kind of correlates with that. So that's like 1 meeting a year on average. So this is not like 3 meetings a year on a calendar year. The first meeting is in North America, second in Europe, and third in Asia. It's like the approximate distribution that we're trying to go for. And the 1-on-1-star meeting policy is like a slightly modified version of this, where we add a wildcard meeting at the end. Okay, and the wildcard meeting is like pretty much to add some amount of flexibility. So this could be a meeting in a new region, for example, the LACNIC region, so where we had the Buenos Aires meeting. So that would probably fall under the wildcard. And also, we are also talking about fully virtual meetings. So if you have a fully virtual meeting in the near future, we could add it in as a star meeting. Okay, so either we could replace an existing meeting, or we could make it as an additional meeting in a year. So the other thing, like you probably cannot read because I made it too small, is that additional meetings can either be physical or virtual. But the idea of the star meeting is like to give us the flexibility to do all this. And the final points is that we don't have to strongly adhere to the policy like every year, because we understand like it's not always possible to follow the policy every year. So like the IAOC people can tell you, since we set like dates like 3 years in advance and start looking, it may not always be possible to find a venue that fits in a given region. So maybe we might need to change something over, but the goal is to, in the long term, follow back into the same pattern, not like do it, like adhere to it in a calendar year. But that's the goal, to try to do it, but if you cannot, like at least in the longer term, to even it out. Okay. And something that's written in the draft is that, so if you look at like a few years ago, like 6, 7 years ago, we had like very little participation from Asia. And then you see at some point, the participation starting to go up, right? And that's what caused the policy to move from the previous one, which was a 3-to-1 policy, to this one, okay? So at some point, we need to build in something where we say we reevaluate this thing at some point of time, right? And so that's like one of the things that is probably open for discussion as well. So just to put in the open issues, this is either something that's unresolved in the draft or something that came up in the discussion, or these things over there, okay? So should attracting new participants be one of the stated goals of this policy, okay? And do we need a more precise definition of the geographical regions? So should we go with the RIR definition? So should we say LACNIC region, AREN region, RIPE region instead, right? So that's like a more precise definition, because when we say North America, right, people could say, okay, is Mexico North America or not, right? So, and some, like I'm sure people, or is Hawaii Asia or not, right? It's stuff like that. Like people have like very flexible definitions of these things. So do we leave it flexible, or we do something more rigid? Like, and I've seen people talking for both of them, but that's something we need to resolve. And so another thing that came up is like, how does this wildcard meeting proposal come about? So the idea is like this comes from the community. So somebody who wants like a meeting in some other place comes up with a proposal for it, proposes it, and if the community agrees, then IOC goes and finds like a location and plans everything out. So that's kind of the broad thinking, but maybe it requires more ironing out. And the last thing is like, how do we reevaluate? Like, do we say like every 3 years or 4 years we reevaluate, or is it like we're going to say like, okay, the participation has changed dramatically, so we should reevaluate? So is it going to be need-based or just periodic? So that's pretty much the open items from the discussion like we've seen on the list. So any questions, Yari?
Yari, and I guess this is not so much of a question, but a comment. I just want to highlight that there's the past how we run this, and then the way that you've written the draft, or we together have discussed what the draft should say, what the procedure going forward should be, and then there's a couple of differences with regards to the wildcard meeting, for instance. There, previously it was very unclear who is actually in charge. Is it the ISG, IETF chair? Exactly what happens. The draft tries to be more clear about, somebody needs to propose it in the leadership, I guess, but it's ultimately a community decision that yes, we're fine with going to, say, Australia or New Zealand or South America. And the other thing is that it generalizes the concept of the wildcard. Previously, we were only thinking about this in terms of the geographical thing. Now you're talking about adding a meeting, deleting a meeting, virtual meeting, and so on. And I just want to highlight that to the group.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Fred?
Okay, Fred Baker. Cisco. Your bullet number 1 there, should attracting new participants be one of the stated goals of the policy? That's something that kind of perennially comes up. And the question I would ask, and this is literally a question, does going to a new place with a meeting historically, has that resulted in more people from that area being involved in the IETF? Does it actually attract new participants? I would say that in the Adelaide meeting, we did not result in having a significant increase in Australian or New Zealand participation. We've got a few people from that area, but we had a few people before. And so it wasn't bad, but it didn't achieve that goal. And I've got a question out to Ray. He hasn't given me an answer yet about the Buenos Aires meeting. We had some first-time attendees there from South America, and how many of them are here this week? And not that 2 data points are a trend, but it would be interesting to know whether having a meeting in an area actually increases participation. I would not automatically assume that it actually does. So I'd like to base that kind of a thing on data.
Okay, thanks, Fred.
As to the more precise definition of geographical regions, I wonder if that would work against us. So for example, the meetings committee has looked at the question of putting a meeting in Turkey. This weekend would not be a good weekend for that. But the argument for putting one in Turkey is that functionally it's part of Europe. And and what is the definition of that continent anyway? But it's kind of close enough. And we've looked at Malta for the same kind of an argument that, well, if you can get to Europe, you can probably get to Malta. I could make the same argument with Marrakesh in Morocco. I mean, if you can get to Rome, you can get to Marrakesh. So I don't know that the precise definition actually helps. I think it closes off some opportunities. So now at the next point where we start talking about, so let's have a meeting every 12 years in Africa or something like that, or you know, or whatever that would turn out to be, then I think we actually do want to name the continent.
Okay. Thanks, Fred. I think it's a very good point. Like, I think this has been divisive, like, and that's why I put it up in there, because like there are some people who strongly believe that we need a more precise definition. I'm really on your camp as well, like where like a looser definition gives us more room to like do something in a given region if you have like a slightly looser definition of the region. But yes, since it has come up, I put it up for discussion. So thank you. Thanks for Dave.
Dave Crocker, several points. Can you back up the slides? Several, let's see. Nope, I think that's the one, yes. So first of all, thank you for doing this. It's a good job, and so many comments are after saying that, or that as a foundation. The text that says, without extensively impacting the regular meetings, I originally read that as meaning that it doesn't affect the meetings, but since we have 3 a year, an asterisk by existing practice replaces one of them. I consider that a pretty big effect. And I'm not quite sure what wording to put in, and some of the comments since suggest the idea of possibly adding an asterisk meeting as an extra, which I'd be very surprised if we actually did, but it's an interesting idea. But that wording probably needs to be a little different, and normally I try to offer suggestions. I don't have one right now for that.
Okay.
So I wanted to register that.
So can I answer you like first? Like I'll just tell you what my thinking was when I wrote it, right? Like, so the idea is like, let's say we want to do fully virtual meetings, like without ever going to a place. When we first want to try it, like instead of replacing a meeting with a virtual meeting, can we try to run it as a virtual meeting between 2 regular meetings? So that's what I wanted to mean by that. So if it doesn't convey that information, we can reword the thing, but that was the idea. So instead of like going straight into a virtual meeting to replace a meeting, we try to do it as an additional meeting so that the current meeting schedule still works, right? Like, and still work gets done. And if you get a successful meeting with a virtual meeting, at some point we can look at replacing the meeting.
So as a particular, that's a really interesting one. As a policy at the larger level that you're trying to do for this, that's too particular. And that's why I don't know what language to suggest. I think it's a cool idea. I wasn't trying to talk against that. It's just I'm not quite sure how to make this wording handle both what we've done and this interesting case. Also, you almost in passing used some language that I was finding myself liking quite a lot concerning the reason for the 1-1-1 distribution. Normally, our phrasing is very basic, very generic, and it says, quote unquote, to share the pain. And that's true, but I think it may not be concrete enough for everyone to get the point. In your language, I found myself thinking, we should include some language like this, and it was about both time zone and travel convenience. Yeah. And I think we ought to add some language that says the idea is, or the intent is, that people find accessing remotely within their time zone more convenient, and or traveling to the venue more convenient. Okay. And the reason, first of all, it's an affirmative kind of language, and it's concrete, so it's easy to relate to. And the other is, as we look at asterisk situations, and we see ones that might violate those goals, we can be really clear about that effect. So something that serves to be inconvenient for essentially all attendees, we might want to think about a little harder.
Okay, thanks.
So that was that. And then going to the one that I sent an email on that you may or may not have had a chance to read because it was not very long ago, the last slide, the question slide. So number one, I think, reduces to in whether choosing venues is something that we should do reactively based on participation or proactively based on a hope of participation. And the history so far has been that it's reactive and I never thought Adelaide was trying to get bigger participation from the South Pacific. We had other reasons for going there, and that's fine. But as an example of the number one goal, I don't think it was there. We went to China in reaction to an emerging trend of increased participation, so I don't think that actually qualifies. BA is the only one that I think we've done that could qualify as this. And as I try to point out in the email, we need to consider this issue also in terms of damage as well as hope for benefit, which is decreased participation. And there's an exchange that's been happening just in recent minutes with Ted Lemon and me that is creative. He's coming up with some interesting views. But I think we need to be very careful about how we think about this. And part of the real challenge is it's an appealing idea. It's appealing pretty much, certainly to me and from what I can tell everybody else, but that doesn't mean that it's right.
Right. So in my view, like it's very hard to, even if that kind of causation exists, it's very hard to prove, right? Like, so we don't know if we are reactive or proactive, like it's probably, we can guess now, but the draft doesn't contain anything in this stuff, but it's something that has come up on the mailing list recently, right? So the idea is like, we still discuss this, and if we decide not to put anything there, we don't put anything there. But right now the text in the draft doesn't contain any such language, okay, as a stated goal. Nalini?
Sure. Yeah, I actually wanted to react a little bit to what Fred was talking about, and when my stuff comes up, that's some of the stuff I did want to talk about is metrics and definitions for this very reason. There's a lot of talk about we went to X, did that really make a difference? And there's a lot of nuance to that particular question as well. I mean, if I'll just use a small analogy, is like if you have a 5 foot, the first step to your house is 5 foot high, only the people who can do a standing high jump of 5 feet can get into your house. If you have a stair step that has maybe 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, if you have a ladder, possibly others could also come into your house. And so, as I say, I'll leave the rest of that until my discussion.
Thanks, Nalini. Ray?
Ray Pelletier, I wanted to talk a little bit about attendance at the regions and the impact of being in a locality, for example. So for example, Yokohama, more than 500 of the attendees were from Asia. If you look at Asian attendees at Europe and North America, it's less than 250. When we were in Latin America, when we were in Buenos Aires, the attendance from there was 130. And normally it's 4, 5, 6, okay? We're here in Germany. Typically the attendance elsewhere is in the 30s. It's 160. So where we go has an impact on the participation from the region. It's more affordable, it's more accessible, the time zones, et cetera, et cetera. Remotely, now in Buenos Aires, we had 600 folks, more than 600 folks that registered remotely and attended in that fashion. And my recommendation is that we require registration for remote participants, but we'll have that discussion some other time. So 600 folks have registered, and we had hundreds from India, for example, and a lot from Latin America. For this particular meeting, we have over 200 registered so far. More than 50 are from Latin America, We didn't have that before. And more than 50 are from, let's see, Germany. Yeah, from Germany as well. Now, from India, I'm sorry, from India. So we're getting attendance from other regions in which they're showing a level of interest. And I know, for example, this particular meeting, the Indian government is underwriting the attendance for people to attend this meeting and to attend every future meeting, in fact, so that they want to demonstrate that they're attending. So where we go impacts who attends.
Thanks, Ray. Lisa?
Alyssa Cooper. So a couple of reactions on questions 1 and 2. On the first one, I think, I mean, if you look at the draft that Andrew and I wrote, we have a fairly emphatic no as an answer to this question. And I think, you know, to me, part of the reason for that is that if you look at the goals of the IETF and the work that actually goes on here, we have no equivalent policy for something that I would think is much more important than the geographic distribution of the people authoring RFCs or coming to the meetings, which is the kind of impact of the actual work. So, you know, we never sit down and say, oh, like all these other SDOs or closed development efforts or innovative things happening on the internet, where do they meet? Where does Open Daylight meet? Where does the What Working Group meet? Where do the developers who are implementing the things that are getting worked on here, where are they meeting? Or are they meeting at all? Like, we never do that analysis, right, in any structured way.
Yep.
And so why would we do this before we would do that,
Yep.
right? So to me, the sort of orienting the principle around increasing or growing or sustaining participation in the IETF as a model for doing internet engineering should be oriented towards the work that we want to see happen here and what's going on in the industry and what's innovative and cutting edge. And my hope would be that that would include people from all over the world. It doesn't. And we should definitely think about ways to make it easier for people from all over the world to contribute to the work of the IETF, but that doesn't mean necessarily the meeting venue policy.
Okay.
To number 2, I think there's one missing piece in order to be able to answer this question is whether the geographical regions are defined for the purpose of, as you say, sort of cost and time of travel, or if travel entry and visa regulations are included in that. Because obviously, when you say that Vancouver's in Asia, that means one thing for cost of, or for potentially for cost and for time of travel from certain Asian countries, but it means something entirely different for entry regulations. And I think we kind of need a decision about whether those are under this umbrella or not before we can answer number 2.
So I have an answer for that. Like, you may not like it, but that's that second thing, like the stuff you're talking about, right? It's like picking a venue inside the region. So that's something we can probably work on afterwards if we define the region, right? So I'm sure it can influence it, but the definition has to be independent. Like we can decide to define the region in whatever way, but picking a venue inside the region would be like exactly like you say, like there's more nuancing there.
Maybe. I mean, if it was really about like distance, then we could define the regions using like lat long, you know what I mean? I mean, we wouldn't even need to use the country boundaries, right? But clearly we're not going to do that. So we're using we're using country and region boundaries for some reason, but to me it's not totally clear. I get what you're saying, that even then within the region, then there's a lot of variation there. But I do feel like if there's a question about like, is Hawaii a reasonable compromise because it's easy to travel to from some parts of Asia, that is important to understand that you're discounting something else, which is that it may not be easy to, even if it takes a shorter amount of time, it may not be easy to get in for some number of people.
Okay.
So
I get your point. Yeah, thanks.
Dave Crocker, so Alyssa's observation that we could target a venue based on its being a stronghold of potential developers or other interest groups like that is fascinating to me. Fred probably would be unhappy though that would mean we'd go to San Jose.
that's not what I said though. I didn't say that we would follow that pattern. I just meant that, like why would we establish a policy based on geography if we don't establish an equivalent policy based on how can we attract these people who are working on something that we think is important to work on here? That's what I meant. I didn't mean that we should go to Silicon Valley.
Well, I was trying to think through an implication of it. I was actually quite liking the idea of targeting populations that are directly relevant to us. At any rate, the reason I got up was Ray's comments about increased attendance. There's a certain amount of, well, of course we get more local people, but this is where that difference between observers and participants, or actually I guess the right word is observers and contributors, is so essential. In terms of overall meeting attendance and aggregate revenue, it's just fine to have lots of locals. In terms of getting work done, not necessarily.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and I'm channeling John Clancy again, and this time he's replying to Ray. Ray, counting the face-to-face presence of actual participants is fine. That is entirely consistent with what Dave described as reactive. Counting registrations or attendance is less interesting, especially if the people involved have not actually participated before and do not participate later. We need to be careful not to confuse what is easy to measure with metrics of actual interest.
Thanks, John. Yeah.
Following up partly on that and partly on Dave's comments, I think there's a process that a person goes through in becoming an IETF somebody. You don't show up at your first meeting and start producing documents. That rarely, if ever, happens. What you might do is start commenting on a mailing list. And then after some period of time, well, you know, I've got something burning a hole in my pants and I need to file a document. And you know, maybe eventually you become a working group chair and who knows what, but you know, there's a process over time. And so this question was kind of what I was getting at with my query to Ray. How many people that were new in BA are here this time? Because that's kind of the first step to actually be showing up on a mailing list or showing up at the next meeting.
Okay, thanks, Fred. So I can give you some anecdotal stuff. Like I think Christian can probably give you like better information about this, but there is like stuff that's happening. So Nalini is doing some stuff like that as well. So there's like people are trying to form review teams, right? Like so people who are in the Buenos Aires IETF, like who participate either remotely or physically, right? They're trying to form some kind of communities which like read drafts, like, you know, they have a mentor assigned. So I think there's going to be a time lag before we see any effect of this. So, but there is at least some effort to make this translate into longer term participation, okay? And whether or not it works out, we don't know, but there is some stuff. And there's also another thing, like, so Ray was talking about the Indian government, right? So they're actually trying to do interop labs. So they're looking at stuff that's coming out of IETF working groups and try to set up an interop lab as the first step. Like even before commenting on anything, they just take the technologies, put them together, test it, and try to find issues with it. So like, I fully agree with you, but there is some effort. We don't know if it'll actually come through or not. We hope.
Yeah, we don't know what the outcome is going to be there. I'm involved in one of those internet draft reading groups, and had breakfast this morning with Ted Mooney from ISOC, who is looking at membership and what can we do with membership and what can we achieve. And I asked him the question of whether Nalini's program should be an ISOC program. Can we get chapters to look at drafts that are in their area and comment on them? Mm-hmm. I think there's a number of interesting things there. We'll see what actually shakes loose.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Fred. Yari?
I wanted to follow up a little bit on the discussion on number 2 here. I am personally of the opinion that we don't need a particularly precise definition. These definitions are okay. But I did want to follow up on what Alisa said about what's the purpose of this and why are we measuring actual distances or are we measuring something else? Or target something else, and there's obviously tons of differences. Like I think the differences between visa practices within a continent are bigger than between continents. So, you know, if I land at a place where I have to stand for two hours on a immigration line, you know, I could have easily traveled, you know, an hour or two further and you know, go through the immigration without waiting. So I mean, there's some trade-offs there, but it just points to the situation where I think we are, that this is a multidimensional problem. We have multiple criteria. What you're trying to do here is to establish the high-level principles of, you know, sharing the pain from the geographical point of view. It doesn't mean that the other things aren't important. And I do very much agree that the concept of trying to figure out, you know, where the interesting leading edge work is on, you know, whether it's Bitcoin or open source or gaming or whatever, I think that's probably where the bang is mostly for us. And I stated this on the list, but can say it here on the mic again. It's not our policy to, you know, go to a country to increase the participation as such. You have to see, you know, significant participation from there beforehand, or from the region at least. We could of course talk about where the line is.
So just to, like, I agree with you personally, right? Like, this is just something that came up for discussion on the list. So that's why it's here. Like, so everybody gets on the same page at the end. And I do have a thought for like what Alisa said, but probably I'll suggest text on there. So if I give you like a broad outline, right, because it's very hard to like make it very specific, what we're trying to do is like optimize for people in a given region. So that may mean that the meeting may not be in the region, but like we are trying to still optimize for people in Asia. So for example, right, if we want to have an Asia region meeting, we want to optimize for them. So if that means like going to some country which requires visas for everybody in Asia, may not fit the bill, other than a place where, so I'll try to craft some text, but we are optimizing for participants in that region. That's kind of the goal. Thanks for pointing that out, right? Like, it's kind of like something.
But you also shouldn't add Fred's draft into your document, I think.
Thanks. Pete?
This is Pete Resnick. Fred's comment about, you know, it is a process to become a participant and it takes some time. And that may be the case, but then we've got to start thinking about how to measure for that. I think it would be much easier, given the data we've got now, to measure the inverse. That is, start looking for people who newly participate on mailing lists and contribute things to those mailing lists. Filter those people, figure out when they started and whether their starting corresponds to any meeting they might have attended. And you can survey them if you want and say, when was the first meeting you went? Have you gone to any meetings? We may discover pretty quickly that there's no correlation between participation and where we happen to hold IETF meetings. And I think, you know, to put a point on John and Dave's comments, figuring out that there is participation at face-to-face meetings is not an interesting number at all. It really comes down to, are people participating on mailing lists, and figuring out what caused them to do that, that we can start asking questions about.
Thanks, Pete. Corinne?
Hi, Corinne Cat from Article 19. I'm channeling a question from Niels, also from Article 19. So he said the current policy has a clear bias to those already participating. This is something that's been said on the list several times. It's understandable, but it's also dangerous because it favors the existing cohort. And as has been said time and time again, IETF could benefit from new participants, not just in a, gee, wouldn't that be fun, but also in a sense of getting different perspectives that are more adequately reflective of the global internet users community. And using this policy to attract new people, I mean, I feel that the consensus in the room is it's not a good idea. So him and myself would like to speak up of we need to at least consider this, especially as long as we don't have those metrics.
Okay, thank you. Christian?
So going back to the impact of the meeting itself, I do agree with Pete that we should do more complex measuring on participation in order to see if it was effective or not. I do not agree with his conclusion. I think that we will realize that it has an impact, but it's not because of the meeting itself. It's all the process before the meeting. engaging people because there's going to be a meeting, and that's a work that we have to do like 2 years in advance or 3 years in advance. And the meeting itself, it's like a carrot or something that deserves the effort to engage and see and participate, and all the things we've been doing with remote hubs and the pre-IETF calls and things like that. So I agree that it's not the meeting itself, but I think that the meeting helps a lot on the process before. And if we were able to measure that, it's going to be there.
Okay, thank you. Harald?
Harald Avestran, who started participating after going to a meeting.
In Norway?
No, it was outside of my region. Remember that you measure what you measure, not what you want to measure. In particular, to Pete's comments about mailing lists, although which have traditionally been a mail-centric organization, there are other tools. In some groups in which I participate outside of the IETF, it's common to find new contributors on GitHub who never say anything on the mailing lists. Remember to keep human judgment in. It's probably appropriate for the drafts to say only that, for a BCP to say only that we shall try to measure and leave the actual measuring methodology to less stable documents.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we've exhausted the queue here, but I actually have a question here, and this came up in a discussion that Melinda had this morning again, and this is basically how we see the policy document. I'm like, you have concentrated on the kind of like meeting rotation as a policy. But what we see as a policy document also should be doing according to the charter, and looking at that, giving policy guidance to that, when to trigger Fred's or somebody else's policy, the processes actually. And what I'm kind of wondering is that your document doesn't talk about any other policy to the meetings except the geographical rotation.
Right, like, so it does refer to Fred's draft about the implementation of the policy, but it doesn't do anything more. So like maybe there is some more text that's needed there for sure. So yeah, it pretty much says the IAOC implements it, like, and it follows like stuff like in Fred's draft to find a venue.
Yeah, the thing is that if you look at our, maybe I'm not kind of like putting myself very clearly here, but the kind of like, what are kind of like the, what are working, a roadmap kind of says is that we should have a policy document first and then process that implements that policy. And now we have your document actually referring to Fred's document as kind of the input to the policy. So the process is inputting the policy. And I'm just wondering that, or what I would like to encourage perhaps is people to think outside of the what is already there, kind of on the, in terms of meeting rotation, and providing guidance to what Fred's document is doing on processes on other areas as well, because we do have other processes that talk about, there's more policy needed than just kind of what is the geographical location.
Well, and we've identified a particular change that needs to be made in that regard. So,
right,
in terms of disaster recovery.
Right, and that is one of the things that should be kind of like in the policy, reflected in the policy document as well. The other thing is partly why we're here and why we're discussing is that we had the long discussion about going to Singapore and things like that. Those are currently not visible in any of the documents kind of as an policy kind of issue, giving guidance basically how to decide where we can go. It's not a regional thing, it's perhaps a different thing. And the question is at all, do we need that kind of guidance or not? And those kind of things I would hope that people would think about and have some discussion on the list, and perhaps provide then text to either this document or some other document.
Okay. So Fred Baker, let me throw out a comment on that last sentence or two. I actually think it would be, I won't say harmful, but not helpful, to have a list of things, because almost by definition, it's incomplete. And it makes for some issues. We go through a variety of trade-offs in picking any venue, and there is no perfect venue. I guarantee, you know, we could spend winter at the North Pole if we want, but why? And so what Andrew and Alyssa's document does in trying to guide that, those trade-offs, I think that's actually useful. But to sit down and say, we have to ask ourselves whether there are green people or whether there are, you know, I think that ultimately becomes handcuffs. And I don't think that helps.
Yeah, I think in general, to put it more generally, you know, the question is, what could be included in the documents that might have helped deal with that situation? And I think it's probably the case that what Andrew and Alyssa have written would help. But is there, you know, basically what can we do to help avoid these situations in the future, or maybe not so much to avoid them, but to deal with them when they happen? So.
Well, and there are some very open conflicts in this. We have people that would like us to have a meeting in Africa. If you go to Google and type in 77 countries in which it's illegal to be gay, you'll find a map. And it turns out that in most countries in Africa and most countries in the Middle East that you might actually consider putting a meeting in, that some of them have the death penalty for being gay. And so if you give me I'm sorry, I can't go there if they don't like gay people. I can't go there. You know, it creates a real roadblock. And what I think is actually helpful is to give us guidance of how to structure things, how to investigate things, so that we can send people to safe places and still, you know, achieve other goals.
Yeah, I completely hear what you're saying, and I agree with that. The thing is, basically, what I would say is that currently the draft only focuses on the geographic issue.
How does the crank turn?
Yeah, and how does the crank turn? And there might be other issues that might be also worthwhile considering. And I agree with you that kind of having a checklist, borrowing your kind of like words, I think we would end up having a very long checklist and only having meetings on a rowboat in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
Depending how the rowboat is made, if that's actually accessible for everybody. But the kind of like, and that's something that we shouldn't have, most probably, is a very rigid list. But I think this is a more complex issue than just geographic consideration.
That's a fair statement.
Jari, I just want to follow up on what you had said about policy and these different drafts. So I wanted to do a little reread of the charter, and at least as we try to write it, whether that's actually clear, that's a different thing. But it tries to say that you need to do three things. You need to have a specification of a geographic IETF meeting policy. That's the 111 star. You need to have a specification of the meeting venue selection criteria. That could be Fred's draft. But it's very much policy also, that the criteria is policy. And I, you know, within that, I would also lump Andrew's and Alice's draft, which is about talking about the priorities, and that's an important aspect. And then finally, the third thing is meeting venue selection process, which is also very important. It has things like, you know, we're revealing these things at certain points in time, so, you know, broader set of people can look at that and find issues and so forth. So that's the goal. How you actually slice and dice these drafts, that's a matter for the working group, and I don't really care so much, but that was what we sort of tried to make the task be. Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Alyssa Cooper. I very much associate myself with your comments, Melinda, that one of my concerns and one of the reasons why Andrew and I put the draft together is because I think it would be a terrible shame and missed opportunity if this working group concludes and the community has a lot more transparency around what the criteria are and what the policies are, but the IOC has really no better guidance that helps them not end up in situations like we ended up in with IETF 100 or with other similarly potentially controversial locations. So the trouble with that is that defining bright lines in a policy document that could reduce such ambiguity is extremely controversial. And so the question in my mind has been, can we write something down for some of these aspects that effectively does narrow the decision space for the IOC while also being able to obtain consensus and not completely inflaming this corner or that corner of the community. And that to me is the big open question about this, because I know the criteria that I would write that would accomplish that, but some of those things, people even in our draft, we're hesitant to articulate them fully. So to me, that is the big question. But if we don't do something that narrows the decision space for the IOC, then I don't think we can count this as having been a successful effort. Personally, I would love if we could just pick 6 locations and rotate among them for the next 4 years and then reevaluate. I think it would dramatically reduce the workload on the IOC. I think the IETF's work would still progress at the same slow or fast rate as it does. And I think we could focus our efforts in terms of increasing participation around where the work is coming from and not where in the world, but where in the industry. But that's unlikely to happen. So I totally agree with you, but I don't know how to get there.
Yeah, Suresh needs to leave. I actually have a comment, but getting you out of here safely is the first priority. So are there more comments that need to be directed to Suresh before he goes?
My comment is in reply to Alyssa.
Okay.
May I? Or may I
All right, well,
not?
thank you so much. Okay, and I just wanted to clarify that I'm not asking, I would not be interested in seeing specific criteria laid out or a laundry list, but I do think there is this question about a process to deal with these controversial situations.
So Tobias Gondrom, I'm on the IOC, but what I'm saying now is IOC head off, okay? So as a personal. This is a little bit complicated. So from a practical perspective, of course, it would be easy to have only a few locations, okay? Of course. But I see this also in a kind of from the opposite side. If you have only a few locations, you are actually price discriminating against people who are not in these locations. One thing is like we want to avoid discrimination against certain groups or make it hard for them, but we are actually, if you choose only a few set of countries, you're discriminating against everybody else. And by price, because it will be more expensive, it will be difficult to get there, you may not get a visa quickly. If you need a month to get a visa to a country instead of maybe no visa at all, that's a discriminating act that's more difficult for you. So I'm careful to say, oh, we should have only a few locations because I'm very concerned of the huge diversity we have here. And maybe we need to make the effort to allow everybody in the IETF to come to meetings. And yeah, that's my personal opinion.
Leslie Daigle, on the IOC, all of these remarks are mostly personal. I think I agree strongly with Alyssa's comments about the importance of this process concluding with some pretty clear guidance for the IOC, because the IOC never intends to spring surprises on the community. So to the extent that we can actually have a clear understanding of what the community wants, we're happy to implement that. But to the question of how to avoid laundry lists and whatnot, I think that we probably need to understand that at some level, there are things that we just can't. This can't be a one-shot deal to try to capture everything that we ever thought about in terms of how we want our meetings to be, or else it will be unimplementable. For things that maybe are too specific to try to capture or that will come up after we've successfully concluded this working group, I think we need to have a part of the process that can capture more dynamic input from the community. So that's part of what we've tried to do with, since Buenos Aires, putting out lists of cities that or locations that we're considering before we actually engage too closely with those committees, exactly to try to determine whether there are unknown hotspots with them. And I think that kind of thing is the way to capture some of that more dynamic or issues that will come up later that we won't think of at this time. I'm not saying it's the right process, but maybe this group wants to try to think of determining which things can actually be captured in a specification document and how to specify sort of a cleanup process or an expectation for how to capture other things afterwards.
Thank you. And for this topic, the mic is closed after Ray, so.
Okay. Nalini Elkins. One thing I think is that when mistakes are made, it's a really good idea to try and figure out why it is that it happened. For example, if you only have one eye, you're going to be tending to go towards the left all the time if that's the eye that's missing. And so I suspect, I don't know, I suspect that maybe lack of transparency about how the decision process happened was one possible problem, which I think is being addressed. But I wonder if that might be a fruitful thing to think about, is why did such a thing as the whole chaos around Singapore happen? Is it because we tend to be very engineering focused and possibly ignore or discount or be unaware of the historical and political context in which we live? I wonder if that's not even talked about, because that is not something that you can measure that clearly. And we tend to be in the engineering and not in the liberal arts, which some of us probably look down upon. Just a joke, just a joke. The other thing about, it's possibly not a bad idea to say, we're going to meet in these 6 places. Well, fine. Then maybe you subsidize the people who don't live and who have a hard time to get to those. Yes, that's tricky. But as I say, there's more than one solution to some of these problems.
Ray Pelletier, I'd like to get to the point where we're doing what Alyssa said. And in Europe, I think we're there. Berlin, Prague, someplace else. Berlin, Prague, someplace else. Someplace else is London, Paris, Copenhagen, Madrid. Someplace else, Berlin, Prague. And we do Berlin, we do a couple of contracts at one time with Berlin, so we get good rates. Same thing with Prague. So we can do that. Successful meetings, people seem to like it. You don't get much feedback. In North America, Vancouver, San Francisco, what's on the East Coast? We haven't figured that out yet. We really haven't had much on the East Coast. Was it Boston? Is it Miami? Washington, D.C. doesn't work. Okay, is it Atlanta? Let's pick a couple and then do blah, 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 and then someplace else. Asia, we don't have enough experience. Yokohama, okay, but 2 small hotels run a convention center, and if we apply the criteria of 400, minimum 400 at a hotel, that's not going to work. However, together, that works. They're right next to each other. That worked. Is Yokohama acceptable? Probably. Okay, so what's the next one? Seoul? Seoul could be the second one. We don't know yet. We'll have some experience there this time around, and we'll find out. But what's the third one? We don't have enough experience in Asia to do that yet. I'd love to get there. Saves us a lot of time. We could probably save some money with regard to the booking guest room rates, meeting space costs, etc. Happy to do that.
Okay, thanks. Next up is Andrew and Alyssa's draft. So let me.
Hi there, I'm Andrew Sullivan, and I am one of the offenders behind this. So we have just this one slide, and it's just these questions, because I'm assuming that you've all read this, and if you haven't, well, we didn't come here to tell you what the draft says. You can read it yourself. The goal, of course, is to get a list of objectives and principles that will allow decision making. And I think that this has been a thing that several people have said at the microphone. And so I have these questions, whether this is a useful effort at all, like whether people think that's a good thing to do, whether there are objectives that should have been in this document that aren't there, and if so, then you got to tell us where. There are also, we've got maybe objectives that have shown up there but that people think are wrong. And then finally, are they in the right order? It's an ordered list. The whole thing's an ordered list, and therefore the ones that are first are the ones that are most important, and the things that come later, they lose if you have to trade them off. That's why you have an ordered list. These are my questions. That's all I have to say, so I hope people have something to say about it, or I'll shut up and sit down.
Dave Crocker, thank you for clarifying that it is an ordered list. I probably, for this community, shouldn't be surprised to find out that network access is more important than safety and security. but I'm gonna ask about that anyhow. That's the problem. It's a fairly short list. I think all the items on there are quite reasonable. The fact that it's ordered is a problem, because I believe that many of those items are all top priority and mandatory, and the calling them ordered ends up distracting from that fact.
So you think that that if we had to trade physical security and the availability of the network off against one another, you wouldn't want to have a trade there? You would just say, no, if one of these can't be satisfied, we just can't go there, period.
That's right.
Okay.
I think there is a core set of requirements that if we don't satisfy every one of them, we can't have a successful meeting.
And by physical security, what do you mean there?
Well, yes, that's an extensive question.
So that's the other thing about these, right? These are objectives and they're big categories. And so part of the reason that they're big categories like this is also because it's a short list, but they're ordered. And the reason that physical security loses that thing is because, in fact, we have gone to some places where I personally felt that my physical security was in less good shape than my network connectivity. And we've been there like in the last year or two. So that is something that, you know, a newly restored Canadian can say about, you know, for instance, the United States. And so those are trade-offs that I think we've made. We've decided, for instance, to go to several places with open carry laws. From, you know, speaking as somebody who didn't grow up with that, that's pretty weird.
So I apologize. I've only scanned your document. I got the headlines. I didn't get fine-grained detail. To the extent that that kind of subtlety in a priority like that isn't already in the text, it's probably worth the extra words to help clarify it so people see that a particular item like safety and security has more complexity to it than might automatically be obvious.
Okay.
Jari Arko, and since you didn't really present your draft, and you know, I sent some comments on the list, and you know, people have probably read that, so I don't need to repeat those comments.
Yes, we did, and thank you for the comments. They were good.
You know, so maybe that's enough for our discussion, or maybe not. I'll just raise two things. So one thing that I thought was important and was kind of unclear in the draft, which is you know, the visa situation. You know, I realized that some of these things are you know, hugely different, but you know, many of them demonstrate themselves as, you know, my inability or my colleagues' inability to enter a meeting, or unwillingness to go to a country or place or city. You know, and visa is one of those things. I'd like to see the visa sort of, you know, make it clear that that's part of your categorization there. Oh, and I really want to say that, yes, this is a very useful effort. I'm not sure if your list is correctly ordered yet. That's a discussion for the working group to have. but it's a very, very, very useful effort, and that's exactly in the category of helping the IOC limit options and understand what the community wants, and that's good. And the other thing was network access, and I felt that the text was a little funny. Maybe I think it sort of misses maybe distinctions. I think we could probably survive with hotel and venue access being totally open, and we can't compromise on that. No, there's no way around that. We absolutely must have that. But if some other networks sort of outside in the city were not as open, then I really don't like networks being filtered at all. I'm totally against it. I think that's a totally stupid idea, but I'm not sure that's exactly in the right place in your ordering of criteria. I would put that part a little bit lower, and there was also some technical stuff. So you picked mobile networks and not the cafeteria Wi-Fi, for instance. And so working on those two, I think, will be useful.
So just on the sort of structure of the document, so I should have responded to this, but I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I didn't write one at all. The idea of the way that we put the exclusions stuff, the very first exclusions, it sort of has the formal legal exclusions, and then it's got like, discriminatory practices at the point of entry, which is essentially visa problems, right? And so first of all, it sounds like that's just not clear enough, and that would be good to.
Exactly, we were unclear if you meant visa also.
So that's fine with me, but the other question that I have about this is whether it would be better to break those out into individual named things. So we went back and forth about this, and we ended up lumping them together as kind of one thing because it's legal exclusions, but it's like on a spectrum in which some of them are worse than others, and so maybe we just need to make the distinction explicit.
This is just my opinion. I like relatively small set of categories as opposed to very long list.
Sure.
Alyssa Cooper. I just wanted to highlight that I think the issues that Yari raised around network access are probably among the most important ones to actually get clarity on, whether in this draft or otherwise in this whole working group. And that's like to me is the marquee example where if we finish and the IOC does not have better guidance about that, then it will continue to wring its hands about venues where internet access is restricted or filtered or surveilled or what have you, and that I think is unnecessary if we think that we can get IETF consensus around a brighter line there. So we did it one way, we sort of piggybacked it onto the hotel and venue network access. That's not the only way to do it, but I do think it needs to be addressed some way.
Leslie Daigle, Thinking Hat Enterprises. I think that ordering or listing the objectives this way is hiding a little bit of nuance that is actually important. I think that for listing the objectives, the objectives in an ordered list is fine. I'm not so clear about the non-objectives. In particular, for something like the one roof as a non-objective. I appreciate the sentiment in the document talking about how, yeah, it's nice to have everything under one roof, but it really can't be the driving function that we won't go to Asia because we can't find one roof. But on the other hand, some of us still remember Vienna, where it was not only not one roof, but it was a significant trudge from the main hotel to the meeting venue, and most people weren't even able to get into the main hotel. So I think that we would like to consider that still not, I think we would be flayed alive if we ever asserted that fit what we expect for our meeting environment now. And I'm not suggesting that the document actually get clearer about how, just how far apart the roofs can be, but rather maybe some of these non-objectives need to be taken out of the document altogether because there are nuances there.
So I think This is a really important point, and it's actually, it goes right to the heart of why I thought this was something to work on, and not just to fold into the other meeting venue draft that originally came around. Because my feeling about the other draft is that it's this long list of things that you have to take into account, and then it says, well, you have to trade them off. And I have no idea how to do that. And so instead of saying, oh, well, one roof, which is like a rule kind of ish, instead we've got this thing about how the whole point of this thing is to encourage these kinds of interactions, right? We don't have meetings so that we can make decisions because we make those on the list. So what are the goals of this thing? Well, it's to encourage these kinds of things. The problem with the Vienna example that you're talking about is that it doesn't encourage that. Not that it's not one roof, but actually that everybody's spread all over the place, and you're not, you don't get the kind of interaction that you want. And if you know that that is one of the criteria, then you just include that and you say, okay, well, this is actually part of the goal. This is the kind of thing that you have to do. In order to have that kind of guidance be useful, actually, the number of things has to be shorter, and we need to start listing some things that have come to be semi-official things that we say to one another that are not actually criteria, and they shouldn't have been in the first place.
So I mean, I like the logic, and I think that you're sort of reinforcing my point that the one roof non-objective, for instance, should be taken out. You might have instead an appendix of scenarios where you actually step through some of that logic, for example.
I'd like to, Ray Pelletier, I'd like to just mention an implementation expectation here. And that is that the IETF has set a meetings calendar through 2022. We're negotiating contracts now through 2019. Any implementation is going to take effect in 2020. Okay.
That's an interesting point.
So I think that that's an interesting and valuable point, but I'm also hoping, and I believe that this is true, just so that everybody's clear about this, but I'm hoping that, everybody involved in these meeting selections are listening carefully to this discussion, because I'm certainly hoping that tentative conclusions that people reach in these discussions, even if the document isn't published and officially IETF, consensus and so on, have already started to shape people's thinking. At least that's what I'm hoping.
Hello, Alstom. I think there's a problem with wording in the section entitled non-objectives. It should say something like stuff that needs to be considered, but these are not rules. And it's if you're thinking logically, it means the same thing, but it's a wording issue. And you probably need to have an introduction section or a section about the introduction of this BCP, which says something like, we forgive Ray every misjudgment he has ever made before this point.
So before you go, though, I want to say, at least from my point of view, I won't speak for Alyssa, at least from my point of view, the three things that we list in non-objectives are hard non-objectives. They are things that I do not want to consider, period. One roof is not a thing I want to consider. Maximizing attendance, absolutely, is not a thing I want to consider. I want that not to be one of the things that people maximize. And I don't care about geographic outreach. I think that's a non-objective. I think that's something we should not consider, because I think it perverts our selection.
Okay, that's a different criterion that I read from the discussion and the document. Thank you.
I mean, there are many drafts in the world, and this one is mine and Alyssa's.
Yeah, I agree with that. Again, this is just to the point of like crossing things off the list. Like these are like, the whole point is to be very explicit. Is if there anything we could possibly take off the list of considerations, like those are the three that we came down to.
Yeah, just kind of like cutting the mic after you off. So,
Dave Crocker, further thought on prioritizing rather than having a core set of requirements. Thinking more about your making clear something like security and safety is nuanced. Yes, but drawing the line is difficult, but there are core levels of safety that are not negotiable, and others that are, however, unfortunately are. And going back to Alyssa's repeated and to my thinking entirely appropriate encouragement that the group needs to be doing things that gives guidance for the decision making in the future. It is exactly this kind of distinction between there must be some level of safety and there's other levels we'd like, but maybe we can trade off. The document needs to find a way to make this distinction, I think. I don't have guidance about how to do it because I think it's difficult, but to be useful, I think we have to do that.
Hi, channeling John Clenson again. One of the problems with not until 4 or 5 years from now is that it has often seemed to be an excuse for not doing something the community wants, or more generally, no change because it is too far away to consider. That doesn't make it less real, but we need to be a lot more careful about it than we have been in the past. It is also a reason why it is important that the IAOC be more forthcoming about hotel or venue contracts and what is being negotiated.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I do have then a question for the chairs, and that is, what do you want us to do with this?
Yeah, actually, I was going to say, there's this basic question about the disposition of the text and what happens next, and we're going to take that to the mailing list. So, after one quick question, what would you like to have happen to it?
What would we like to have happen to it? If it is useful, then we will continue to work on it. And if it's something that people think, won't work, then we won't. And I don't care if it gets folded into another document or whatever. I'm happy, whatever. Mostly I'm here to be useful.
Okay, cool. All right, Nalini, Fred.
Speaking for myself, I think it's a useful document.
That's not right, the slideshow.
Okay, thanks. The reason that we did this is because in a lot of the drafts in this particular area, the words participation, contributor, and so forth are used, and to me it just seems a little the definition seems unclear. In fact, though, there is a de facto definition that we all seem to be using, which in some ways seems unfair or counterproductive. And that's actually why we wrote this draft. There's statements within, I believe, Fred's draft that talk about that the physical meetings are based on participation. So, well, what kind of participation, and what do we mean by participation? And if it's physical participation only, then I mean, just to joke a little bit, I suppose, it's like, well, why don't we have the meeting in Cisco headquarters? I mean, so so you have to consider what does physical participation mean? And if only the people who can afford to come are counted, is that really fair? And how is the world changing? And as we just saw here today, there's a lot of questions about, does participation increase after a meeting? Well, what does participation mean? And if it does or doesn't increase, what might be the reason for it? So I think those things need to be considered. There's also a lot of the regions, I know, of course, Latin America, India, and Africa. There's a lot of outreach going on. And I think it is a goal to have an IETF meeting in the region. There's a lot of, it's a concrete thing that you can build a lot of outreach around. And so I think having some metrics are useful for the region. So for a number of different reasons, I wanted to propose some kind of definitions for what we mean by participation and propose some somewhat, hopefully some fair metrics whereby we can do this. Yeah. So there's a lot of ways of looking at participation. Two particular things come to mind. One is what you might call fundamental participation. That's in writing the actual standards, actually in doing protocol work. That's whether it's writing a draft, whatever, that's fundamental participation. And then process kinds of things. I suppose something like meeting venue, that would be a process kind of participation. I'm not making a lot of judgments at this point about what's better, what's not, but I think that is something that we should discuss. And there's also various types of participation, the physical, I suppose the way you participate by email, remote, especially now that we're getting more and more our remote hubs. And I also hear it said a lot that our real work is done over email. And yet, when we talk about this 1-1-1 policy or whatever, then that measurement appears to be physical participation. It's not clear to me that if our real work is done over email, then what are the counts then? How many people have actually participated by email? Do we have those? So what I am thinking is that, oh, please.
Pete Resnick, I've been reading over the draft and trying to get my head around this, and if you could go back one slide for a second. There seems to be some sort of language mismatch here, because there's participating in the work of the IETF, that is contributing to documents, participating. There are different types of doing that. The official stuff goes on in email, but the 1-1-1 is to say those people who have been participating through contribution in email by writing documents, doing those things, those are the ones that we are looking to if we are going to have a physical event, to get those people closest or shared pain, as some people have been using, to that event. But the participation itself is the contributing to documents and contributing on the mailing list to discussions. And I think to say that, well, there's these different physical participation and remote and email is probably carving the turkey the wrong way.
Well, I wonder, well, let me ask. I mean, if actual email participation is being taken into account in deciding the physical venue, might I see those metrics?
Now we get to a secondary question, which is, are we actually doing the measurement and checking to see if the participation is based on the draft authors and the email lists and such? I don't know if that's happening. I'm claiming that the design was the people who are contributing to the process are the ones that we should move the meetings closer to or share the pain among.
No, totally agree with that. Totally agree with that. But I think the de facto of what's happening, and probably because it's easier, is that what is happening is that people who physically attend are being taken into account. Fred, yeah, can you talk to that?
I would dispute that. We certainly have physical attendance figures. We get those from Ray every meeting. We also look pretty hard at where internet drafts come from.
Sure.
Okay. So to my knowledge, we don't have anybody that's going out and looking at the archives and seeing, who and how many posted to IETF or, to
Working
this
group,
list or
whatever,
whatever.
sure.
And maybe we should.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
but I would not say that it's all physical attendance because I know I'm looking at other things.
Sure, sure. No, I agree. I think looking at RFCs, I don't know if looking at drafts, but looking at RFCs, but I think email lists is a real form of contribution. I think attending remotely is a real form of contribution. And now, especially now that we have more and more remote hubs. And I think for emerging economies especially, it's a lot easier to attend remotely. Yeah. Alyssa?
Yeah, I think one of the values of having the working group here is that we don't have to be constrained by whatever information or lack thereof went into previous policy setting, right? So I don't think it's possible that amongst all of the wise people who were there at the time, they could recreate exactly the circumstances that led to the 111 star policy being minuted by the IOC at the time when it was. But that doesn't mean that the basis on which that decision was taken was correct or well-informed or not well-informed, but it doesn't matter because we can decide anew since that's, one of the goals of this working group is to write down the policy. So I don't think we need to be constrained by however any of this has or has not been defined in the past. We can just decide, like, what do we think makes sense going forward?
No, totally. The only reason I brought that up is because there have been comments on the email list to the effect, like, don't even do this because it's going to be counterproductive and harmful to the IETF. And all I'm saying is that if you don't do this, there's actually a de facto policy in place.
So Dave Crocker, the idea of starting with a tabula rasa for forming policy is very appealing. It carries an enormous amount of risk when there's in fact a long-established practice. If the long-established practice really sucks, then starting over can be a really good thing. If there's some basis for believing that it has some merits, then starting over can be extremely destructive because it is disruptive. And so I think in this case that for all the problems we have, the established practice has enough merit to warrant looking for ways to improve rather than looking for ways to ignore. With respect to participation, I have been liking the distinction between observation versus contribution. I've come to believe participation is actually a counterproductive term because the participation ends up really referring to just showing up. And as much as that's okay, it's not actually helpful. What's helpful is contributing. We have a variety of things that are contributions. A name on a document is an example, but there's lots of other examples. And I think that the hard part here is for us to be clear about what constitutes contribution that we can in fact form metrics about, which means there's some degree of objectivity to it, versus other forms of contribution that might be nice, but we really don't know how to measure it. And so a hallway conversation where a stray person happens to make a stray suggestion could be enormously helpful, but how the hell do we measure it? The closest, and I even have an example in my own case where that happened, and it was happening to sit down when a couple people were having a drink before going into a working group. And it helped that work, which is fine. How do you measure that? And the answer, I think, is you don't. It happens. It would be nice if we could count it. I don't think we can. The closest it might come, and this is the metric that I think that we should extend to, is if a name shows up in an acknowledgement section in a document, that's a contributor, whatever caused it to appear. But if we focus on measuring contributors, It doesn't matter where the venues are, doesn't matter what the media are, your document gets much simpler. We ignore physicality, we only count contribution. All of the tutorial in your document that has to do with media, which is to say venues and methods of exchange, becomes irrelevant.
Okay, a couple of reactions. One, this is all about meeting venue. And it is about, where to hold meetings. And so that was kind of the focus on it, because that's how it started out is we hold meetings where we have contributors, because I actually like those terms really well too, is contributor and observer. The other thing that has to be balanced is fairness. We have to get the work done. And I'm going to say, I'm tending to say, I'm not thinking that we're, everything's all totally messed up and we got to start over completely from scratch. Yes, we can add things, but if things were totally messed up, the IETF wouldn't work. And by and large, the IETF does work. By and large, the standards do run the internet real well. By and large, the thing works. There's a few things that will have to change. It's an evolving process. And so, yeah, I think as new emerging countries come into the process, as new technology for remote access become better and better, yeah, I think we have to kind of rethink how we do this. And we have to do it in the context of fairness, both to people who actually contribute a lot, and trying to get the work done, but also fairness to people where there's people doing outreach, and to say, sure, come on, we need new contributors. And I'm going to say we need new contributors, and we totally need new regions, because they provide perspectives. If we have contributors only from one culture doing standards, that's not a long-term recipe for success. And yes, there are many different kinds of perspectives. Cultural is one perspective.
Quick question.
Sorry.
Right, we've only got 4 minutes left.
Sorry.
So my question to you is how do you want to use that time? We could continue discussion, or you could continue moving forward. It's up to you.
Oh, okay, sorry, I'll stop expounding.
No, it's okay. And the
let
other
me-
thing is that you would straight into a discussion that's not about metrics, really. It's about advocacy and.
Right.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, let me finish real quick, and then let's take discussion, because I think we're going to have to go offline. What I'd like to do is go real quick, and then ask people. The question I want to know is, does anybody else other than me think that this is even something we should do? That's really my basic question.
Do you want a poll of the room right now?
Sure.
All right, poll of the room. How many of you, if you think this work ought to go forward? And at this point, I'm saying go forward at all, not necessarily in this working group, but.
Have you closed the mic lines?
Beg your pardon?
Have you closed the mic lines? I wanted to make a comment before making that call.
Okay, yeah.
Had a lot of John. I'll make it short. And the purpose of the IETF is to make the internet work better. I like the idea very much of trying to measure how contributing makes the internet work better. But I think we have to focus on that. But there's a large section missing in your document. It's entitled Security. Security considerations. If you measure something, people will adapt their behavior in order to influence your decisions according to what you measure. You need to consider security of measurement. I'll stop there.
Sure, yeah.
And this is Andrew Sullivan, and I have a clarifying question on the question that you were putting to us. So,
Okay.
when you say this go forward, are you talking about this in this form that is like with the definitions that are in there or so on? Or do you just mean the kind of measurement-y thing in general, but maybe with?
The kind of measurement-y thing in
Okay,
general,
thank you.
yes. Okay, who thinks that there would be value in a measurement project like this within the IETF? Hum, please. Who thinks this would not be valuable? Please, hum, please. Okay, so we're going to take it to the, we are out of time. Well, we've got 1 minute left, but we will take this to the mailing list and also discuss it with Yari because
Great,
this is.
great, thank you.
And I was asking about advertisement.
Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to mention that tomorrow morning, there's a sort of related session called iMeeting, which came out of the IETF 100 discussions. We're going to have a couple of outside experts come in and talk to us, provide a little education around how organizations of different kinds deal with human rights considerations as they think about their operations. So a broader context than just meeting arrangements and broader than just the issues related to IETF 100, but trying to just provide a little bit of information and education for the IETF crowd. So come along to that if you're interested. Thanks. It's called iMeeting, IMTG. I think it's in the morning slot tomorrow. Oh yes, it shares the slot with Slim, so it's starting at 11:30. Thank you for knowing the details better than me.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got some stuff to take to the mailing list for further discussion. If you have not yet read Fred's draft, please do, and to answer the question of whether or not it should be adopted as a working group deliverable. And anything else? That call ends Friday.
I think we're done.
I think we're done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Each question doesn't need to be spontaneous. Right.